Good evening. I'm Alan Matisow, Associate Director of the Baker Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Institute tonight for a special event. Ever since the Institute began 15 years ago, its principal purpose has been to conduct research in the area of public policy for the benefit of people who actually make it. But we have another purpose, and that is to offer educational opportunities for the students of Rice University and also for members of the Houston community. We do this in a number of ways, but the most important way is to bring to the university and to this podium diplomats, public officials, journalists, scholars, people who have distinction in the world of public policy. And we are particularly interested in having here members of that world from abroad. Tonight, our focus is on France. And I would like to note for the benefit of our French visitors that French culture is alive on the Rice campus. We have courses in the French language that are oversubscribed, and many of our students, in disproportionate numbers, actually, and not surprisingly, select Paris as the place where they travel when they go abroad. I would like to mention one course in particular. One of our professors, Deborah Nelson Campbell, spent a whole semester teaching her students about Nice in preparation for a trip that they will take there in a couple of weeks. The highlight of that trip will be a reception at the City Hall in Nice, which happens to be a sister city of Houston, hosted by the adjunct mayor. And I would like to especially thank the members of the French consulate here in Houston who made this possible. It'll be an event that our students will never forget. The Institute, thanks to Ambassador Dirigian, has been cultivating relations with IFRI, which is the French Institute of Foreign Relations, one of the leading think tanks in France. As a result of this collaboration, last summer, 4 of our undergraduates went to IFRI to serve as interns with some of the distinguished scholars who work there. 4 more will be going this summer. And I am pleased to note that we are interested in IFRI, and IFRI is interested in us. I note on their website that on May the 12th, they will give a symposium entitled "The Dysfunctional Institutions of America." Is the U.S. democratic system endangered? I await their answer to that question. Today's speaker is Anne-Marie Idrac, Minister of State for Foreign Trade. We are very grateful to the Minister for taking time from her very busy schedule to spend an hour with us at the Baker Institute. We've asked John Ambler of our Political Science Department to introduce the Minister. John got his PhD at Stanford in 1964, joined the Rice faculty that year, and has been here ever since. I've known him for almost half a century, and I can tell you that Professor Ambler is one of the great professors in the university. He's won the Distinguished Teaching Award so often that they finally told him he was not eligible to win it anymore. And he has a number of publications, all of them about French politics. They include the French Army in Politics, 1945 to 62, The Government Politics of France, The French Socialist Experiment, and The French Welfare State. Professor Ambler will introduce the Minister, and if you'll come up to the podium, John, you can do that.
I would only amend that introduction to let you know that I began winning awards only when Alan maxed out and was no longer eligible. So he preceded me. Our speaker today has had a very eminent career. She followed the Voie Royale, the royal road through higher education. She went to the Institute of Political Studies, Sciences Po in Paris, then to a highly selective School of Administration, the INA, the National School of Administration. And it's this route that a very large number of leaders in France follow, not simply in public administration, but in government, in politics, even in the private sector. She belongs to then a real elite. And as a political scientist, I can only admire the wisdom of France. I can only admire the wisdom of France in selecting their elites through the Institute of Political Studies. If only we could do better. I also have fond memories of Sciences Po. That's where I've done much of my research over the years, both at the Institut and across the street at the Bar Basile. Wonderful place. At INA, the National School of Administration, Madame Idrac, I see, graduated in the class, the promotion, which was named the Simone Weil promotion, named after one of the most highly respected and influential women in recent French history. From there, she went to a number of public administration positions, environment, urban planning, regional planning and administration, and finally toward public transportation, where she's had probably her most important impact. In 2002, she was named head of the RATP, the Paris Transit Authority. Then in 2006, of the SNCF, the National Railroad Corporation. In that year of 2006, Fortune magazine, noting that the SNCF had an annual income of $26 billion, named her as one of the 50 most powerful women in the world. We have her before us. In each of these positions, she's left a mark. For example, as director of rural development in the district of Cergy-Pontoise, she helped found the University of Cergy. As head of the Paris Transit Authority, she reformed retirement financing, always a problem. And she pushed through a plan for guaranteed minimal service during a strike, also a very difficult issue. As CEO of the SNCF, she helped plan development of high-speed railroads, at which France, of course, is a worldwide leader, across European borders. Now, Sciences Po, INA, a number of increasingly important administrative and planning positions, and of course, scattered in were periods as a member of the government, typical of the most successful people in her cohort. She became Minister of State for Transportation under Prime Minister Alain Juppé from 1995 to 97, and her present position as Minister of State for Foreign Trade, she's held since March of 2008 in the Fillon government. And again, like most of her successful colleagues, she's been elected to Parliament. First in 1997 and again in 2002. And I find it interesting. Her political affiliation, at least at the beginning, was with the centrist European UDF, the Union for French Democracy, which is heir of the MRP, the Popular Republican movement, whose founder and leader was her father. So she has followed in this path of what's probably the only real Christian democratic party that France has known in the post-Second World War period. Now, although the MRP no longer exists, some of its heirs still do. She's also very modern. She has a website. And the website has links to all sorts of things. Fascinating. You push one here. Anne-Marie in Beijing. Anne-Marie in Moscow. Anne-Marie in Ankara. And the stories that go along with the text of some of the speeches she gave are wonderful. I particularly call to your attention, if you're interested, the presentation that she made in Beijing a year or so ago. The job she's had in transportation had a very strong international element. It is not surprising that she was found suitable for a Ministry of Foreign Trade position. She's also, I might add, accustomed to tough negotiations. The trade unions in the transport sector are among the most powerful and the intransigent in France. You may have noticed when the airlines were grounded by volcanic ash, the railroad workers refused to call off their strike. Now, she didn't solve all the problems, and that's it, but she has dealt with very difficult problems. It is then with my pleasure and also my great privilege to present to you Madame la Ministre Anne-Marie Idrac.
Thank you very much. I promise that as soon as this conference is ended, I shall write a few words on my site about the question and the interesting discussion I'm sure we shall have. In fact, you forgot one thing in your presentation. It was the fact that I have been, I don't know if I dare say that, I have been a member of the board of the IFRI, which, yes, but maybe it's a little dangerous to say that at the beginning of this presentation. I must say that I'm very honored and pleased to be invited of such a famous institution and try sharing with you a few views about the relationships between the States, France, and Europe. My first conviction I want to share with you is the fact that we have more in common between us, between European, France, and the US, than we have differences. And my second conviction is that this community between us is more and more important as the world is changing. It is more and more important to have common use between Europeans and Americans in the dialogue with emerging countries, for example, Chinese. And it is more and more important and even more crucial than when Europe and US were the only leaders of the world. As an introduction, I want to point out 4 points. The first one, I already said a few about it, is that the global balance is shifting from developed countries to emerging countries. We need to consider them as partners as well as competitors if we want to remain together major actors of the world economy and politics. Second point is that spending 2/3 of my time outside of France as a Minister of Foreign Trade, position which was held by Christine Lagarde before me, I'm everywhere here that the crisis is an opportunity, a double opportunity. First, opportunity to shift towards a sustainable growth model based on innovation, and especially on green innovation. And second, an opportunity to pave the way for a more regulated economy and finance. Third idea of this introduction, the new competition is about rare resources, all rare resources, human resources and skills. First, natural resources, energy and commodities. Here too, we need to cooperate. And last, I mean France, Europe, and the USA, need a strong Europe. I strongly support President Barroso, you know, the President of the European Commission, in its Europe 2020 project. This crisis is an opportunity to build a more unified Europe. I read on the web this afternoon, when I was in a hotel, just flying back from Chicago, a very interesting declaration by the Secretary General of the OECD. He said the crisis, referring to the Greek crisis of the moment, has proved a very good thing about Europe. It is its capacity to gather all governments around the same table in order to take the right decision. On this basis, I want to draw your attention on 2 main ideas. First, United States and France have a mutual interest in a better global governance. Recovery seems to be ongoing in most economies, so with different pace. Recent indicators show that growth will continue to progress during this first semester of 2010. Financial and trading conditions are still fragile, but have improved. However, temporary measures are starting to be removed, and the favorable impact of the inventory adjustment should pass. The next few months will be a test for all our economies. After stimulus plans, the recovery will need its autonomous engines. In other words, we still have to finish the job. It is time for structural reforms in order to boost the potential growth and in order to prevent other crises. Domestic reforms are not sufficient if we don't fight against global imbalances. They have led to the current crisis and remain a major source of risk for the future. We need to join our efforts to build an effective cooperative framework which should be robust and sustainable for everybody. France and the United States share the same priorities. The first one is that we must consolidate the G20 as a major global forum. The concerted and decisive actions taken by the G20 have permitted to fight effectively against the financial crisis and economic crisis. The G20 has demonstrated its reactivity. It is the appropriate international forum to address economic and financial issues with all the countries around the table. Next year, during our presidency, the French presidency of the G20 and the G7, G8, France is committed to establish the legitimacy of this forum for the longer term. That was the first common goal. The second one is that we must fully implement the G20 finance regulation agenda. And I am referring, of course, to remuneration practices, to banking regulations, including, by the way, an effort about standard agencies, and also the fight against non-cooperative jurisdictions. The spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF a few days or weeks ago have shown shared views, once again, between the US, France, and Europe on these questions. But we need to convince other players, among them, of course, emerging countries. Third point, we must find solutions to revitalize the multilateral trade system. This means completing as soon as possible the Doha Round negotiation under the umbrella of the WTO. In order to close remaining gaps, direct engagement at the highest political level is necessary, and once again, it comes to the G20. We should build to reach an agreement on this Doha Round negotiation. We should build on the progress already made. In other words, we should avoid to reopen the texts which were almost agreed in 2008. We should avoid a restart from the beginning, which would surely lead the Doha Round to a failure. But we need also to start discussion on new commercial issues. First, some of them that have been pushed aside, like investment or public procurement. But also, let's say, 21st century issues. For example, how can trade rules ignore the social or environmental issues? How can the WTO ignore, let's say, carbon dumping or social dumping or any sort of dumpings? I discussed, for example, these questions with US Congressman Sander Levin, who is now the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee at the House of Representatives, and I saw that we agreed on many of these points. President Sarkozy strongly supports a dialogue with the United States on all of these issues, but especially maybe on the carbon dumping. France and other European member states are pushing for border measures in Europe. These would be the best means to avoid carbon leakage and good incentives for other countries to commit to fighting climate change. I know that the same debate is taking place in the US Congress. It is a question of climate change and a question of fair trade. Of course, we must continue to address the climate change challenge. The Copenhagen Agreement must be considered as a starting point. Our priority should be an early implementation of this deal. All countries should engage in significant efforts and demonstrate their will to go forward. Discussion should continue involving all willing countries. Most important remaining questions are, as said before, how to tackle carbon leakage, and also how to finance the fight against climate change. A high-level advisory group has been set up by the United Nations. It will make concrete recommendations on operational sources of finance. The experts will examine options for public funding, maybe innovative sources of finance. We, France, for example, support the idea of a financial transaction tax, of which a product could be dedicated to fight against climate change, especially for poor countries. Of course, we'll examine as well options for private funding. The development of carbon markets is one of the sources of financing. The role of financial institutions, including multilateral development banks, will be important in designing these new mechanisms. Those were the main points on which I think that we could focus together in the global dialogues. Second point is to focus on the fact that France is doing also its homework, which is reforming its economy and society. Thanks for giving a few examples of what we try to do, especially in the dialogue with the unions. Since President Sarkozy has been elected in 2007, France is on the move. Many key factors of the French economy, let's say labor legislation, tax system, corporate legislation, innovation, and economic immigration, and so on, and so on. All of these factors have been subject to major reforms, which are all helping to improve the business environment and the global French competitiveness. The French government's first priority is to boost an entrepreneurship and innovation culture. Let me give you a few examples of the reforms we have already implemented. The French labor legislation has been deeply reformed. It is more flexible, allowing employees to work on Sunday, for example. One of the most famous sentences by President Sarkozy is that the French people should work more to earn more, which is even more liberal than right for work, which is, I know from the Council, a famous phrase in this country. Another example, industrial investments have been exempted from local business tax, called taxe professionnelle, which of course you know very well, Professor. Corporate legislation has been simplified. Financial asset management regulations have been modernized to boost the Paris investment market and make the French legal environment more attractive to investors. Innovation is encouraged through a series of new measures. France's research tax credit is said to be the most attractive research and development tax incentive in Europe. Universities have been reformed in order especially to build bridges with the business communities. A $35 billion so-called national bond has been launched to invest for the future, for example, in the French biotech industry, which I quote as I promoted our specialized company of this booming industry yesterday in Chicago, yesterday and this morning in Chicago at the so-called Bio 2010 convention. Thanks to these measures, I want to recall you that France is the world's 5th largest economy, and that in terms of international trade, despite the crisis last year, we remain the 6th exporter in terms of goods and the 4th in terms of services. Of course, you all know, being interested by the French situation, that 17 French companies are among the world's 200 largest companies in fields like oil, you know, Total, and services, banks, insurance, and other important industries. France is the world's 2nd largest recipient of foreign investment. The US were last year the 2nd foreign investor in France after Germany. For example, last year, Microsoft decided to settle a new R&D center in France. In the field of renewable energy, the US leader First Solar announced in December 2009 its decision to build in France its biggest solar plant in association with the French company EDF. After this fight for innovation and competitiveness, the 2nd strategic shift is to engage France in a green revolution. France has taken active steps towards building a competitive and sustainable growth through what we call the Grenelle Environment Roundtable talks. I remember very well when the results of these talks were presented to President Sarkozy. Senator Gore was there, and he said that maybe everybody around the world should need, he said, a Grenelle, a global Grenelle, did he say. Grenelle being, by the way, the place where many social discussions occurred in the past. You know that, of course, very well. Since last year, many measures have already been passed in law in order to implement reforms in terms of energy, in terms of new standards for building, for cars, for example, whatever. France has devoted 20% of its economic stimulus plan to green growth. It makes our country the first of the European Union for eco-friendly stimulus measures, ahead of Germany and the UK, for example. France aims at being a world leader in decarbonized energy by maintaining our lead in nuclear energy and developing our renewable energy capacities. In this positive context, we also commit ourselves very much in terms of water facilities all over the world, in terms of waste management all over the world, and the capacity of our big companies, but also a lot of SMEs linked with academic and local authorities are developing a global view of what is and what will be a green economy. I think that conditions are met for a stronger transatlantic economic relationship in several fields. You said I was the CEO and chairperson of the French Railway. That's why I am personally interested, but all French people are very interested about the rail plan pushed by President Obama. France can offer the full range of its skills, from engineering in railways, but also trade building, for operating the train system, and so on. I was in California a few months ago to discuss that with Governor Schwarzenegger. I will travel to Florida tomorrow, or maybe Friday, well, this week anyway, to promote these French centers of excellence. And I also discussed of that with the governor of Illinois yesterday in Chicago. Railway, as many other important infrastructure and industrial issues, are not only technical issues, but also need a global economic model, global economic pattern, not only for transportation itself, but with a clear view of the local development, for example, of a state or a city. Another field of cooperation between our two countries is energy. All our countries are looking of all sorts of energy for their energy mix. You of course know that nuclear power plants currently produce in France nearly 80% of our electricity, with 58 plants. I noticed that the US government has chosen to revive nuclear power. It is, of course, an effective means of fighting global warming and produce cheap electricity. However, the French nuclear plant builder, which is a world leader, works closely with the Nuclear Regulatory US Commission to adapt its technology to US regulation. The main technology we are talking about is called EPR. It is a third generation nuclear reactor, particularly safe and powerful. The French electricity company, EDF, I already quoted it, has created with the US group Constellation the Unistar joint venture in order to build the first American EPR reactor in Maryland. France strongly supports this project. Obviously, the French-American relationship is very deep, for historical, for cultural, for political reasons. And we can have great expectation from dealing with global issues to fostering industrial and technological partnerships. To be fully efficient in the global competition, this deep relationship should be supported by a strong Euro-American dialogue. As President Sarkozy said in his Columbia University address a few days ago, Europe and the United States must work together, as I said at the beginning. We definitely need an active strategic political forum on transatlantic economic issues. I must say that unfortunately, though this need is obvious, the EU-United States high-level dialogue has not found really its engine. Until now, what we call the Transatlantic Economic Council, the TEC in French, did not reach the level of ambition needed to build a really strong economic partnership. I'm hopeful because the new European Commissioner, Karel de Gucht, Trade Commissioner, who is, by the way, in the United States next week, personally believes, as I do, in this strategic relationship and is supported by all member states of the European Union. On the other hand, I'm sure that the US administration understands the need for a stronger partnership, as the debate on financial regulation has shown in its Washington 2 weeks ago. A new momentum seems possible and is necessary with the transatlantic dialogue. First, on strategic issues like finance regulation, like relations with China, like energy, like innovation policies, for example, industrial and intellectual property, standards, all these type of things. And second, we have to cooperate more and more on concrete regulatory actions oriented toward quick wins as soon as possible. This could be the next chapter we will write together in next decades. I think once again that Europe, France and the US should really cooperate more and more, for example, towards the challenges that the rising up of China or India or Brazil or whatever this type of countries are really putting on the table as new issues for all of us in the next decade. I'm myself quite optimistic on the possibility on the two sides of the Atlantic Ocean to cooperate and to develop new schemes for sustainable, robust, and as soon as possible high-level growth for today and also for the coming generations. Thank you very much.
I think we all appreciated the remarks of Mr. Idrac, and she has agreed to take some questions, so hold for it.
Can you tell us how and why President Sarkozy won the election against Madame Royale?
Because he was the best. Because he was the best. And because he had, and he always has, a very strong and clear project for our country. I say this sentence about work more to earn more. It is a good symbol of what he wanted to do and what he wants to do. Another thing was his really strong commitment to reform. And I gave few examples of all the reforms we have already begun to do in our country. All the sectors of social, economic, public life have been reformed or are under process of reform. For example, this year we have one, or let's say two main reforms to do. The first one is another pension reform, and the second one is a reform of the local authority, the organization of the local powers between the national state and the regions and the cities. But in almost every field, the reform is the key word. That's why I like to use this expression, France is on the move. On the other hand, compared with the main competitor, the second-turn competitor, who was Mrs. Ségolène Royal, the project of the Socialist Party and the left wing was not very clear, was not very precise. There was not really a project, and majority of the voters thought that Mrs. Ségolène Royal was not as strong as President Sarkozy seemed to be and has revealed to be.
Way back there.
So I've been to France and I've traveled on the SNCF and I loved it. And what are they doing to keep themselves at the top of railway technology?
In terms of railway?
In terms of railway?
Yes. I think that our country is the leading one in terms of railway and has been for decades and decades because we never stopped investment, government investment in new lines, for example, but also technological investment by companies such as Alstom, which is one of the well-known all around the world. And as I said, it's not only a question of technology. For example, it is a question of marketing. It is a question of pricing. It is a question of where the stations are located in the cities. It is a question of connections between the rail itself and the plane and other public transportation, parking lots, and so on. So I think that the main reason is innovation on a global view, which is also the case in terms of energy or other technology in which France is well known.
This week, Houston is a focus for the global oil and gas offshore development, oil and gas industry worldwide. Just curious, what other than the nuclear energy front is France contemplating in other energy sources?
We are not a country of coal, by difference, for example, with Germany. As I said, for electricity, 80% is from nuclear, the other part being from dams, hydroelectric. And we develop all sorts of so-called renewable energies, the first one being solar, including with investment from abroad. I said U.S. companies, but also U.S. company, but also from Japan or other countries. We are developing wind, which is not so easy, I must say, because the population doesn't seem to like very much the view of these modern mills and the noise of these modern mills. So we are working at the moment about wind energy in the sea, not on the ground, because it's difficult to be accepted. And we also try to develop all sorts of biomass energy. You may know that the European goal is 20% of renewable energy until 2020, and France is a leading country in this goal.
Yes.
Madame la Ministre, we are two French students from École Polytechnique, and we were wondering what kind of contracts the United States could sign in the next years with French enterprises like SNCF, RATP, Alstom, or in the nuclear domain with EDF or Areva. Are there many projects in the USA that are related with French corporations?
I must say that US is a first client of France outside Europe. Of course, and that most of the contracts signed are on day-to-day products, consumption products, wine, agriculture, luxury, and all types of industrial and consumption products. In terms of large contracts, we are also already well in good position for several services. I want to quote, for example, Veolia, which has important developments in the US for waste water treatment, and also in terms of public transportation in several cities, bus or tramways. Coming to bigger contracts, which you are thinking about, the main one will be the implementation of what I said about Areva and EDF with the Constellation deal. And we hope very much in development of train, maybe high-speed train in Florida, California. But you know, the idea of a high speed is not exactly the same in France and Europe, where it is 300 and more kilometers an hour. I'm sorry, I can't translate it in miles. And here I know that as a first step, I'm talking about passenger trains. I know as a first step it could be well, medium speed around 200 kilometers per hour. In several areas of the country, due to the new direction given by President Obama, we think that train industry, train rolling stock, train signaling technologies could be interesting for trains and also for public transportation, trams, metro, and this type of thing. And we are focusing a large part of our efforts on this type of technologies.
Your Excellency, to meet these immense challenges of financing the fight against climate change, developing carbon markets, what in your opinion is driving the chronology here? Or is this something that needs to get done in the next 2 years, the next 5 years? Can you give us some idea? You mentioned 2020.
Yes. Of course, Copenhagen was disappointing. It should have been the important step, but it was disappointing. But we think it is nevertheless a sort of a basis to build in. As you know very well, the next step on the global climate discussion will be in Mexico at the end of this year. We think that public opinions all around the world, and it is really my testimony, even in emerging countries who decided not to sign something we wanted to have in Copenhagen, all over the world, public opinion are really very focused on the idea of the scarcity of resources and the goal of improving the greens of growth. On this impulse, we can build. We, for example, have in mind the importance of these goals and issues for the G20. Of course, the G20 is and will be focused about financial and economic issues. But climate are also part, and more part, of economic and financial issues. That's why, for example, when we have the presidency next year, in the 2011, we'll have an important focus on this type of issues among those I already quoted.
Sir? Yes, some years ago I was in the Scientific Council of EDF, and I know that they were the world leader, in my opinion, of clean coal burning. So is France trying to take advantage of this advance? I don't know if we still have it, but we had it some years ago, actually.
Of course we do. Of course we do. One important avenue we are trying to take is to find partners in order to develop this technology, which are not totally under control at the moment, and which are very, very costly to develop. And we are trying to find partners in developed countries, but also in emerging countries. And for example, this is one of the focus of the French-Chinese dialogue, in order to complete the very rich dialogue we already have with this country in terms of nuclear and other energies. I forgot something, sorry, about energy. France is not a country where you find oil. But France is a country which has many important companies in this field. For example, the major French company, Total, is, as you all know very well, an oil company. Other companies like Technip, Vallourec, or other smaller companies are very important in this field, and of course will participate today and tomorrow here in Houston to the OTC forum. Sorry.
Your Excellency, you mentioned California and you mentioned Florida about rail and...
I didn't mention Texas?
And that's what I want to point out, is that 20 years ago, San Antonio and a lot of San Antonio, Dallas, Houston, and Austin were looking at that and working on high speed with the French. And for a variety of reasons, and Mr. Keller is no longer in charge of Southwest. But the point is that today, with what's unfolding, especially if you try to go through the city of Austin and the I-35, you realize that there is that need here in Texas. And I just wanted to know whether you've had any overtures or any opportunities to discuss that.
Yeah. I remember very well. I'm happy there's this question. I remember very well meetings with Texas official several times in Paris or other cities. I just see that in this moment, when the federal government is sharing money between several states and locations in America, in the states, it doesn't seem that Texas at the moment, maybe it will come, it doesn't seem that Texas at the moment is the most aggressive state in order to take its part of this federal budget. And of course, this type of project needs government money, as I said, among other things, and it will need federal money. So why not Texas in the coming years? My feeling is that the states I quoted are really pushing in order to be the best and the more convincing towards the federal government.
I think the problem is our governor. They want their money.
Taking it back to Europe, I wanted to ask whether you think that the current Greek crisis showed some disagreements between Germany and France, and whether, should the crisis spread to Portugal or Spain, you would anticipate that these disagreements might intensify.
As I said at the beginning, this crisis, in fact, and I was using the words said by Secretary General of OECD, this crisis, in fact, proved the capacity of European countries and members of the Eurozone to cooperate and to take the good decisions. The Greek situation is very, very specific. Of course, the basis is the global crisis of last years, which occurred from America and spread all over the world. But over that, the Greek situation is very specific. Unfortunately, we discovered that the figures given by Greece were not fair, were not true. We discovered that this country had more difficulties, budget difficulties, deficit difficulties, that everybody thought. And third, I must say that the rating agencies, in our feeling, are really overreacting. Coming back to Greece, at the moment, the plan has been settled up by European governments with the help of IMF, and we are confident that this will go on and be implemented by the Greek government, even if it is very difficult. At the end of your question, you ask if this could spread to other countries. Why? Why should it spread? Once again, we are totally astonished about the overreaction of some actors, and especially standard agencies. The situation of Spain, for example, is not at all the same. The debt is not as big as the Greek one. The figures and all the facts we have are clear, have always been clear. The Spanish government has a strong policy in order to reduce its budget difficulty. So we don't think that there will be a spread. On the contrary, we think that what have been done in the last weeks is a good example of the better way, the better governance, which is necessary and possible for Europe. I know, because I read American papers, I know that for some Americans it was a little difficult to understand why it was so long and so difficult to decide about the Greek crisis and so on. Yes, it is quite difficult to decide between 27 countries. I must say very friendly that sometimes for European and French people it is a little difficult to understand why it is so long in America to pass such and such law in the Congress, for example. It is a price of democracy on both sides, and it is interesting to try to understand the process if we want to cooperate. So the process of decision between 27 countries, of course, is quite difficult. It has been improved by the recent Lisbon Treaty, which is now current since the beginning of this year, and which has proven that in spite of the strength of the crisis, because the Greek situation is and was very difficult, we were able to manage it quite correctly.
It's 7 o'clock, and the Minister has other places to go, I regret to say. We are very pleased that you spent an hour with us, and I think we're all the beneficiaries of that. So let us express our